Welcome to the Software People Stories. I'm Shiv.
I'm Chitra,
And I'm Gayatri.
We bring you interesting, untold stories of people.
associated with the creation
Or consumption of software-based solutions.
You'll hear stories of what worked.
and sometimes what didn't,
You will also hear very personal experiences.
and insights that would trigger your thoughts.
And inspire you to do even greater things.
Welcome to this episode of the Software People Stories. Today, I'm in conversation with my colleague, Dr. Krishna Prasad, known as KP, who is also a coach at PM Power Consulting, where we talk about the transition from an individual contributor to a middle manager, what kind of challenges one faces and what kind of support would help that kind of a role ease into that role, about being a coach, as well as what KP went through and how he handled his own personal transition from an individual contributor to a middle manager. We also touch upon very briefly the complexities involved in designing systems in the automotive space, particularly with the user experience in focus. That's just a teaser. We'll hopefully have a later conversation. But if you want to know the challenges of the middle and how one can handle that, listen on. Hi, KP. Welcome to this episode of the Software People Stories.
Hey, Shiv. Hi, good morning. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, thanks for coming back. This time, I thought we will probably do a little experiment since our audience would already know your origin story and your career trajectory and all that, which we normally cover. We thought we will go a little deeper and try to understand your experience and perspectives on some things that just came to my mind.
Sure. Hey, I think the word you used, experiment. I keep reading a lot about it nowadays, and how even managers and companies have to experiment with new things. I think it's great that you have also come up with this experimentation idea, for this podcast. So I'm kind of excited to see how the experiment goes.
Yeah, sure, KP. Yeah, even in coaching situations, I find, and I keep also telling many teams, is that don't think everything is predictable. When we do our work, all our due diligence, but with our limitations, our assumptions, we make some postulates. So the proof of the pudding is when, in this case, our listeners come back and have questions or say that we want more of these. Yeah, I thought today we can talk about your experience and perspectives related to two probably related areas. One is about the middle management. Second is about what support middle managers would need and related coaching, etc. So the first thing I'm curious about is to know, how is it being a coach for you? Because the last few years you've now been a coach. So how has that been for you?
Yeah, actually, yes, to be honest, I'm also kind of trying to get into this whole, kind of what we can call as shoes of a coach, but I'm still struggling, so to say. And struggle means, when you're a leader, when you're a manager, kind of managing a part of the business or part of technology, etc. There is a certain different approach we typically take. But the moment you get into the role of a coach, the actual work is done by your coachee, so to say, or the teams you're kind of helping. And it becomes a little bit of a mind shift even for us as coaches, where we have to listen more, because obviously the context of our coaches and teams is kind of different. You probably don't know a whole lot about their environment, at least in the initial periods. You're not kind of really immersed in their environment, so to say. So it's more what you get out of the conversations and so on. And it's extremely important to become a good listener. And I am kind of training myself. I'm telling myself every time that, hey, you please listen to to what the team is telling or what the coachee is telling. And that is, I think, one very important shift, I feel. And the second thing is, we need to get into this mindset that we can only point in the right direction. right? So there is this direction which we can show to our coaches or the teams, as opposed to mapping out the exact route. We cannot get into this thought that, hey, I will map the exact route, for these teams, and they can just march on that route. So all I think we can do is point in the right direction. The team or the coachee or the manager has to find that exact route, on their own, right? And we can possibly provide some guideposts, and we can act as sounding boards, but at the end of the day, it is that manager, it is that team which will have to march on that route and kind of figure out themselves that, okay, that is the route they need to take, and head in the right direction. So this is one big shift, at least I have kind of personally gone through in the last couple of years, when I'm doing this coaching on transformation and coaching for change.
Very interesting. So from being a doer to a get it doneer to an influencer, probably now you're also an instigator of change.
Yes, yeah. I think that kind of is connecting the dots.
Interestingly, one of my recent guests, Naresh Jain, used another term. Normally, we mix the concepts or maybe the roles of a coach, a trainer, and mentor. And many times we keep moving between these roles.
Yes.
Because of the needs of the team or the organization. The fourth term that I heard was the role of a captain.
Okay.
Sometimes, even though you say that you would either just come in, provide some inputs such as training and let them actually implement, or maybe mentor them or coach them to find their own solutions. But sometimes you may need to play the role of a captain. Now, that actually raised another thought in my mind. Typically, the captains are what we may broadly call as the middle management. And many external interventions either happen at the team level, or you do some team training, maybe team coaching, etc. Or it could be at a very high level, saying strategy, transformation, all kinds of things. But in your experience, do you think that the middle management is adequately served in terms of the help or the guidance that they need?
No, I think that's a great question, and we have been talking about it for the last couple of years, and from my own experience, I think the broad group of middle manager. I think this middle manager is a fairly broad group. It's anything in between the executives on the one hand and the kind of real workforce, whether it's engineering workforce or any other kind of functional workforce on the other. And this is the classic sandwich. The middle manager is a classic sandwich in between the executive management on one hand and the kind of real workforce on the other. They always will have to keep wearing at least two hats, if not more. And what I mean by two hats is, at the one hand, they have to understand the strategy which their executives are kind of communicating and shaping, and the kind of choices which at a top level the executives have made within their own company and within their own context. So they need to first understand, okay, this is the strategic choice which their executives have made, the companies have made, and how does that get implemented and executed in my context, as a middle manager, because I need to finally translate that into something meaningful for my own context and for my teams, because my teams are looking up to me and say, hey, look, we keep hearing this big strategy which the company is shaping and defining. How does that influence my work day to day, or 3 months, 6 months, 1 year? The second hat which they obviously have to keep wearing is, how do I get things executed in the right way, the efficiency, productivity, and all the business challenges, and of course more so customer challenge. So they need to keep wearing these hats almost alternatively, and every now and then and every often. So I'm sure the middle managers are in a very, very challenging situation, and they definitely need more help and more support to kind of manage these two, so-called hats and roles in their, kind of daily work.
Yeah, interesting. In the software people stories, we also would love to have personal stories. If you can share how your own transition has been from an individual contributor to maybe the first line manager or the middle management role, we'll be able to relate to the things that you've been saying so far on the sandwiches and getting pulled in double directions and all that.
I think we have heard very often, and it's quoted widespread that, okay, suddenly we all grew up as engineers, and I also grew up in a software engineering world, though of course it was real time, embedded systems for avionics and automotive. So we were building a lot of embedded software for very advanced applications, be it Mercedes-Benz or Tata Motors and so on. As we are growing up in the engineering space, we always get tuned to this whole deterministic thinking and what I call as deterministic or algorithmic thinking. No matter what complex systems we are building, at the end of the day, I want to write an algorithm, I want to write a piece of code which is more deterministic. So if I say, hey, look, I need to achieve this, whether there is a time constraint or memory constraint, etc., it has to achieve this functionality. So all I used to do is get driven by that. Of course, we do design of complex systems, we work with a bunch of engineers, but the world was very deterministic and algorithmic, if I can put it that way. And even when you just move into an entry level, so to say, entry level mid manager, or even managers of managers, I think suddenly the shift happens from an algorithmic thinking, deterministic thinking, to a little bit more probabilistic and driven by hypothesis and driven by assumptions. I can relate to my PhD work because though I come from engineering background, you start doing your research in our primary school and high school. We were told about experiments, right? So you write your hypothesis and then you make some observations in the field, and then you conclude that, hey, yes, my hypothesis is either valid or invalid based on the data. But when we get into this whole manager world, suddenly we tend to forget that many of it is hypothesis. Though we don't explicitly state it, at least it's in our mind that this is based on a particular hypothesis, based on my previous experience, or based on my, the current data available. And it can no longer become deterministic. So I need to gather enough data, I need to make enough observations, and then either confirm that, oh, my hypothesis is valid or not valid. And unfortunately, many of us as middle managers don't get trained to deal with this probabilistic, hypothesis, kind of non-algorithmic kind of thinking, especially when we grew up in an engineering world. And when we are also dealing with our own managers who also have grown up in a kind of engineering world. So I think that's something which we need to get more trained, we need to get more exposed, and get into this whole areas where there is uncertainty and how to deal with this uncertainty.
So how was your maybe first week or first month of taking on a middle management role?
I still remember, there are several things, which were going through in the first weeks and maybe even first few months and maybe first couple of years. I think one of the things which at least I always used to struggle with is I get all my day-to-day challenges. I'm not thinking of, long term, right? I know when you have just become a young manager, etc., we are really not thinking long term. But you still need to go and talk to your boss, or maybe a couple of levels higher, senior managers. They obviously will be speaking at a 10,000 feet level or 30,000 feet level. And one of the big challenges which we always, at least I always faced is, hey, look, I know all the details on the ground because I'm talking to my team members and I know the on the ground challenge which I'm facing. But unfortunately, I cannot tell exactly the same thing to my boss's boss, right? Or the senior manager. So the first struggle which I always used to have is, okay, I know my on the ground challenge, but how do I communicate that which is more from a senior manager's perspective? Is it that I'm asking for help? Or is it that I'm asking for a decision? That clarity many times is not in our mind. Most often, we just want to spit out all the problems we have on the ground and then expect that the manager's manager or the senior manager will give us a solution. So that is the initial years of challenge which I always used to face.
But were there any techniques that helped you, or in hindsight, do you think some help or guidance would have helped you ease the transition?
Yes, it also depends on the kind of, let's say, managers you work with, the kind of leaders you worked with. I still remember, in my earlier Mercedes days, there used to be this, like we always used to have our informal understanding that whenever we used to go to one particular leader, don't always go with just the problem statement, because we used to have our own internal, kind of discussions that if you go with one problem statement with this executive, we would invariably come back with three more problems, right? So always, we would say, okay, this is our problem, but we also have this, minimum two solutions. We want you to give a go ahead either for this solution or that solution. So most often we would kind of fine tune ourselves in terms of asking for a go ahead for one solution, because again, you're already presenting this alternative and you want your kind of boss to say, hey, look, you take this solution. But that came about only based on some of our experiences dealing with this particular executive or manager. I think, I have worked with several managers and several executives and leaders. Most often we find a pattern what this executive or what this leader typically kind of looks for. Some are very detail oriented. I still remember my very early business case, in the Tata group. I was totally unprepared for that. I was presenting a business case. It was a new product, it was a new business, etc. And then I presented all the financials, financial projections, investment needed, all that, and I thought I was completely prepared. But I didn't know that this leader would always focus on assumptions. Business cases are all great, but you tell me what are your top three assumptions. And though I had made some assumptions and had my backup ready, but I was completely unprepared, during that meeting. And he said, I don't give any value to any business case if you're not clear about your assumptions, and you need to tell me your assumptions. That was just one case. But when I started working with some other executives, maybe they look for something else, right? So the point I'm trying to make is, many times we get driven by the executive who you start working with, or the leaders you start working with, and somehow you start adapting your, let's say, discussions and presentations kind of to align with their thinking. I don't know whether that kind of gave some view with the kind of challenges and approaches which at least I took.
Sure, KP. Yeah, that was very interesting. But there is another topic that was triggered by what you said, but probably we'll keep that for another conversation, which is essentially a combination of the experimentation and heuristic approaches that you mentioned earlier with the automotive segment, where what kind of assumptions do you make, particularly for anything that is going on the vehicle, whether it is for the driver, for the passengers, or a combination, whatever is there. Seems to be a pretty complex set of use cases or situations that you need to design for.
Yes, no, I think that's again a great point, because at least last 3-4 years we were kind of working on fairly advanced systems, like whether it's broadly comes under user experience. The whole user experience and infotainment is driven by how easily a driver or an occupant in a vehicle can use the consumer devices and can integrate consumer devices into the car environment and do all kinds of experience all kinds of features during driving. Or again, one of the things which we generally in the engineering community struggle is, we expect clearly defined specifications from either our customers or the person who's writing the specification and so on. And there is absolutely no way that even a team of product requirement engineers, let's put it that way, that they can visualize all these different scenarios, like what kind of devices can come into the car, how they get connected, how they get used, etc. I mean, we can build scenarios, we can build use cases, but there is always going to be limitations in that. And that puts more pressure back on the product development team to think that, hey, these specifications or requirements that have come in are not necessarily the full set. So we also need to wear the hat, for example, of an end user or a driver, and also start figuring out, oh, okay, is this the way maybe a user will use the system? Or so that was one huge kind of challenge. And that's when we used to also say, hey, let's come up with very quick proof of concepts. Let's run this experiment, like if two different devices coming into the car, what could be the the effect, and can we go and discuss with the so-called the OEM customer, and so on. The second thing is in the area of this whole advanced driver assistance, autonomous driving, because the on the field scenario nobody can anticipate. No matter how many kind of test cases we build and test the system, there is simply no chance that we can have full visibility into the kind of real world scenarios. Again, there it used to be this whole kind of experimentation approach that, okay, I know I'm not 100% clear on the exact requirement, but how do I still help my customer to kind of discover the requirement? How can I jointly help him or her to, let's say, clarify some of these requirements and so on? So already we are getting into more, hey, we need to get into a more discovery mode. It's no longer going to be a clearly defined specification. Both customer and the product development team has to kind of evolve based on these different inputs. So that's how we kind of saw these systems evolving in the last few years.
Thanks, KP. I think there are a lot more thoughts that are crossing my mind now in terms of the complexities involved in even modeling or simulating these. But as I said, we will keep that for another conversation. So once again, thanks a lot, KP, for coming on the Software People Stories and sharing your own journey, transition to a middle manager, as well as this transition to a coach. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Shiv. And I know like there are a lot of accomplished, guests which you had on this podcast channel. It is a privilege for me to kind of share some of these thoughts. Yeah, hopefully we can continue this conversation. We have a lot of topics, to maybe talk about.
Thanks.
We thank Siddharth for the music and Anita for promoting the Software People Stories.
If you like this episode,
Please subscribe on your favorite podcast client.
And spread the word in your network.
if you'd like to share your story,
Contact us at podcasts@pm-powerconsulting.com.